Private capital tends to become concentrated in few hands, partly because of competition among the capitalists, and partly because technological development and the increasing division of labor encourage the formation of larger units of production at the expense of smaller ones. The result of these developments is an oligarchy of private capital, the enormous power of which cannot be effectively checked even by a democratically organized political society. This is true since the members of legislative bodies are selected by political parties, largely financed or otherwise influenced by private capitalists who, for all practical purposes, separate the electorate from the legislature. The consequence is that the representatives of the people do not in fact sufficiently protect the interests of the underprivileged sections of the population. Moreover, under existing conditions, private capitalists inevitably control, directly or indirectly, the main sources of information: press, radio, education. It is thus extremely difficult, and indeed in most cases quite impossible, for the individual citizen to come to objective conclusions and to make intelligent use of his political rights. Albert Einstein, Why Socialism? Capitalism as it exists today is, in my opinion, the real source of evils. I am convinced there is only one way to eliminate these grave evils, namely through the establishment of a socialist economy, accompanied by an educational system which would be oriented towards social goals. In such an economy, the means of production are owned by society itself and are utilized in a planned fashion. Albert Einstein, Why Socialism? Up here in Aragon one was among tens of thousands of people, mainly though not entirely of working-class origin, all living at the same level and mingling on terms of equality. In theory it was perfect equality, and even in practice it was not far from it. Many of the normal motives of civilized life, snobbishness, money grubbing, fear of the boss, etc., had simply ceased to exist. The ordinary class division of society had disappeared to an extent that is almost unthinkable in the money-tainted air of England. There was no one there except the peasants and ourselves, and no one owned anyone else as his master. It lasted long enough to have its effect upon anyone who experienced it. However much one cursed at the time, one realized afterwards that one had been in contact with something strange and valuable. One had been in a community where hope was more normal than apathy or cynicism, where the word comrade stood for comradeship and not, as in most countries, for humbug. One had breathed the air of equality. George Orwell, Homage to Catalonia. If machines produce everything we need, the outcome will depend on how things are distributed. Everyone can enjoy a life of luxurious leisure if the machine-produced wealth is shared, or most people can end up miserably poor if the machine owners successfully lobby against wealth redistribution. So far, the trend seems to be toward the second option, with technology driving ever-increasing inequality. Stephen Hawking. You can't talk about solving the economic problem of the Negro without talking about billions of dollars. You can't talk about ending the slums without first saying profit must be taken out of slums. You're really tampering and getting on dangerous ground because you are messing with folk then. You are messing with captains of industry. Now this means that we are treading in difficult water, because it really means that we are saying that something is wrong with capitalism. Martin Luther King Jr. to his staff, 1966. We must recognize that we can't solve our problem now until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power. This means a revolution of values and other things. We must see now that the evils of racism, economic exploitation and militarism are all tied together. You can't really get rid of one without getting rid of the others. The whole structure of American life must be changed. America is a hypocritical nation and we must put our own house in order. Martin Luther King Jr. Report to SCLC Staff, May 1967. Mondragon. Mondragon is the world's biggest cooperative, the largest democratic company. Workers elect the directors and vote to decide how profits are distributed. 81,000 members, 257 sub-companies, €25 billion worth of assets, 7th largest company in Spain. The highest rate of pay is only 9 times higher than the lowest. Workers are rarely fired, the company tends to retrain people in new roles if necessary. Mondragon has its own university, pays to retrain workers if they are made redundant and will pay for their new education. On average, workers are paid 13% more than for equivalent jobs in capitalist firms. There are numerous benefits to a democratic form of business. The company lifespan tends to be longer, workers are rarely fired, wages are higher relative to capitalist businesses, they are less risky to start up and the workplace environment is more friendly. Paris 1871. The first working class revolution and classless society. Workplaces converted to cooperatives, workers elect their own company directors. All elected representatives subject to potential immediate recall, must have consent from their constituency for all decisions. Elimination of hunger, homelessness and prostitution. Everyone's needs catered to. Coal, wood and other necessities like bread, salt, sugar and coffee were distributed for free to those in need or at low prices to those who could afford it. Representatives only paid the average wage, no more than 6,000 francs per year. Ujamaa. Democratic workplaces, elected company directors, workers decide how to distribute profit. Elected representatives cannot own shares in businesses they don't work for, cannot have company directorships and cannot own more than one home. At all levels of representation, representatives are elected by people who know them and can vouch for their good and responsible character. Money has little influence as there are no political marketing campaigns and no lobbying. Substantial improvements to public health, education, literacy rates, economic growth, poverty reduction and life expectancy grew substantially. Nationalization of core industries, commercial banks, import-export firms, insurance companies and the largest agricultural estates. Jamahiriya, state of the masses. Local direct democracy, most businesses converted to democratic cooperatives. Interest-free loans, unusually high rates of home ownership. Free healthcare, free electricity, free education, including university. Newlyweds receive $50,000 grant to buy first home, mothers get $5,000 for each new child. All citizens receive a dividend for the sale of the country's oil. The state pays 50% of the price of your car. Literacy rate increased from 25% to 83% in a few decades. Farmers given land, equipment, seeds and livestock, all for free. Kerala, India's humanist state. Most private enterprises are cooperatives. Highest Human Development Index in India. The second lowest poverty rate. Highest literacy rate. The standard of living is similar to first world countries but without bosses and without politicians who actively try to screw people as much as they can get away with. Almost no homeless people, 90% home ownership, 66% in Australia. Free universal health care, highest life expectancy in India, lowest infant mortality rate, free cancer treatment for those who need it. Highest gender development index in India. Renewable energy sources constitute the bulk of electricity generated. If we ban private individuals or companies from charging rents or interest and also prohibit the payment of dividends to shareholders, convert all businesses to cooperatives, over 90% of people will be better off financially. Most people's income will almost double. This doesn't happen because almost all our politicians receive some sort of passive income from rents, dividends or interest on loans. The Humanist Union. Most necessities of life provided for free or heavily subsidized by the state, including electricity, medicine, education, public transport etc. Generous social security system, old age and disability pensions. enormous reduction in economic inequality, highest income only less than 10 times higher than the lowest, very rapid economic growth, everyone gets richer together instead of just a small oligarchy, unemployment rate of 1%, easy to find work, by far the most feminist country in the world, cheap heavily subsidized public childcare centers, numerous subsidies to help raise children, generous paid maternity leave, highest rates of female employment and enrollment in university, the elimination of prostitution by addressing the social and economic causes, abortions legal and provided for free by the state, equal pay for equal work. A humane, rehabilitative criminal justice system. Genuine internationalism, enormous amounts of assistance given to foreign countries with the intention of forming balanced, mutually beneficial relationships. Rational economic planning to meet the needs of the population rather than generate profit. Planning depends on providing incentives rather than coercion. If a particular job is needed, the state pays people extra to study that career. All education provided for free by the state, most university students were paid to study. Virtual elimination of homelessness, built houses at a faster rate than any other country. Rent did not exceed more than 5% of income. An interest-free loan of 1.5 years' pay given to help buy first home. This probably all sounds too good to be true. A genuinely responsible government that actively tries their best to improve the lives of the population? No such country can exist. Let's imagine that the Humanist Union is a real place. How do you think the leaders of the capitalist countries would react? Would they be humble and acknowledge that humanism is clearly a superior system? Would they acknowledge their mistakes? Could they afford to recognize their mistakes? I doubt they would do these things. They would probably have a highly cynical response, greatly exaggerate any flaws in humanism, not offer any constructive criticism, and probably do mental gymnastics to rationalize their own abuses of authority.
You write in Manufacturing Consent that it's the primary function of the mass media in the United States to mobilize public support for the special interests that dominate the government and the private sector. What are those interests?
Well, if you want to understand the way any society works, ours or any other, the first place to look is who is in a position to make the decisions that determine the way the society functions. Societies differ, but in ours, the major decisions over what happens in the society, decisions over investment and production and distribution and so on, are in the hands of a relatively concentrated network of major corporations and conglomerates and investment firms and so on. They are also the ones who staff the major executive positions in the government, and they're the ones who own the media, and they're the ones who have to be in a position to make the decisions. They have an overwhelmingly dominant role in the way life happens, what's done in the society. Within the economic system, by law and in principle, they dominate. The control over resources and the need to satisfy their interests imposes very sharp constraints on the political system and the ideological system.
When you talk about manufacturing of consent, whose consent is being manufactured?
We can, to start with, there are two different groups. We can get into more detail, but at the first level of approximation, there's two targets for propaganda. One is what's sometimes called the political class. There's maybe 20% of the population which is relatively educated, more or less articulate. They play some kind of role in decision-making. They're supposed to sort of participate in social life, either as managers or cultural managers, like, say, teachers and writers and so on. They're supposed to vote. They're supposed to play some role in the way economic and political and cultural life goes on. Now, their consent is crucial. It's one group that has to be deeply indoctrinated. Then there's maybe 80% of the population whose main function is to follow orders and not to think, and not to pay attention to anything. And they're the ones who usually pay the costs.
All right. Professor Chomsky, you outlined a model with filters that propaganda is sent through. That's way to the public. Can you briefly outline those?
It's basically an institutional analysis of the major media, what we call a propaganda model. We're talking primarily about the national media, those media that sort of set a general agenda that others more or less adhere to the extent that they even pay much attention to national or international affairs. Now, the elite media are the sort of the agenda-setting media. That means the New York Times, the Washington Post, the major television channels, and so on. They set the general framework. Local media more or less adapt to their structure.
World News. Against the soundbite that says that there's a beachhead.
I think 628 is a good one.
Yeah, but I think 6 is a good start. This is the operative soundbite for us. He's ours. He really knows how to time it.
We've got a minute for all the time, so that's...
I love this soundbite.
Okay, well,
And they do this in all sorts of ways, by selection of topics, by distribution of concerns, by emphasis and framing of issues, by filtering of information, by bounding of debate within certain limits.
2.5 minutes to air. 45 seconds.
They determine, they select, they shape, they control, they restrict in order to serve the interests of dominant elite groups in the society.
There is an unusual amount of attention focused today on the 5 nations of Central America.
This is Democracy's Diary. Here for our instruction are triumphs and disasters, the pattern of life's changing fabric. Here is great journalism, a revelation of the past, a guide to the present, and a clue to the future.
The New York Times is certainly the most important newspaper in the United States, and one could argue the most important newspaper in the world. The New York Times plays an enormous role in shaping the perception of the current world on the part of the politically active, educated classes. Also, the New York Times has a special role, and I believe its editors probably feel that they bear a heavy burden in the sense that the New York Times creates history.
What happened years ago may have a bearing on what happens tomorrow. Millions of clippings are preserved in the Times library, all indexed for instant use, a priceless archive of events and the men who make them.
That is, history is what appears in the New York Times archives, the place where people will go to find out what happened is the New York Times. Therefore, it's extremely important, if history is going to be shaped in an appropriate way, that certain things appear, certain things not appear, certain questions be asked, other questions be ignored, and that issues be framed in a particular fashion. Now, in whose interests is the history being so shaped? Well, I think that's not very difficult to answer. Now, to eliminate confusion, all of this has nothing to do with liberal or conservative bias. According to the propaganda model, both liberal and conservative wings of the media, whatever those terms are supposed to mean, fall within the same framework of assumptions. In fact, if the system functions well, it ought to have a liberal bias, or at least appear to, because if it appears to have a liberal bias, that will serve to bound thought even more effectively. In other words, if the press is indeed adversarial and liberal and all these bad things, then how can I go beyond it? They're already so extreme in their opposition to power that to go beyond it would be to take off from the planet. So therefore, it must be that the presuppositions that are accepted in the liberal media are sacrosanct, can't go beyond them. And a well-functioning system would in fact have a bias of that kind. The media would then serve to say, in effect, thus far and no further. We ask, what would you expect of those media on just relatively uncontroversial, guided free market assumptions? And when you look at them, you find a number of major factors entering into determining what their products are. These are what we call the filters. So one of them, for example, is ownership. Who owns them? The major agenda-setting media, after all, what are they? As institutions in the society, what are they? Well, in the first place, they are major corporations, in fact, huge corporations. Furthermore, they're integrated with and sometimes owned by even larger corporations, conglomerates. So, for example, by Westinghouse and GE and so on.
What I wanted to know was how specifically the elites control the media. What I mean is, I guess...
It's like asking, how do the elites control General Motors? Well, why isn't that a question? I mean, General Motors is an institution of the elites. They don't have to control it. They own it. So what we have in the first place is major corporations which are parts of even bigger conglomerates. Now, like any other corporation, they have a product which they sell to a market. The market is advertisers, that is, other businesses. What keeps the media functioning is not the audience. They make money from their advertisers. And remember, we're talking about the elite media, so they're trying to sell a good product, a product which raises advertising rates. And ask your friends in the advertising industry, that means that they want to adjust their audience to the more elite and affluent audience. That raises advertising rates. So what you have is institutions, corporations, big corporations, that are selling relatively privileged audiences to other businesses. Well, what point of view would you expect to come out of this? I mean, without any further assumptions, what you'd predict is that what comes out is a picture of the world, a perception of the world, that satisfies the needs and the interests and the perceptions of the sellers, the buyers, and the product. Now, there are many other factors that press in the same direction. If people try to enter the system who don't have that point of view, they're likely to be excluded somewhere along the way. After all, no institution is going to happily design a mechanism to self-destruct. It's not the way institutions function. So they all work to exclude or marginalize or eliminate dissenting voices or alternative perspectives and so on because they're dysfunctional. They're dysfunctional to the institution itself.
Beep, beep, beep.
Propaganda. Many use the word when talking about countries like North Korea, Kazakhstan, Iran. Countries viewed as authoritarian through the lens of the Western media. Press freedom, freedom of thought. People use those terms when talking about countries like the United States, France, Australia, democracies. In 1988, Noam Chomsky co-authored a book with Edward Herman called Manufacturing Consent. It blasted apart the notion that media acts as a check on political power, that media inform the public, serve the public, so that we can better engage in the political process. In fact, media manufacture our consent. They tell us what those in power need them to tell us so we can fall in line. Democracy is staged with the help of media that work as propaganda machines. Media operate through 5 filters. The first has to do with ownership. Mass media firms are big corporations. Often they're part of even bigger conglomerates. Their endgame, profit. And so it's in their interests to push for whatever guarantees that profit. Critical journalism takes second place to the needs and interests of the corporation. The second filter exposes the real role of advertising. Media costs a lot more than consumers will ever pay. So who fills the gap? Advertisers. And what are the advertisers paying for? Audiences. And so it isn't so much that the media are selling you a product, their output. They're also selling advertisers a product, you. How does the establishment manage the media? That's the third filter. Journalism cannot be a check on power because the very system encourages complicity. Governments, corporations, big institutions know how to play the media game. They know how to influence the news narrative. They feed media scoops, official accounts, interviews with the experts. They make themselves crucial to the process of journalism. So those in power and those who report on them are in bed with each other. If you want to challenge power, you'll be pushed to the margins. Your name won't be down. You won't be getting in. you've lost your access. You've lost the story. When the media, journalists, whistleblowers, sources stray away from the consensus, they get flagged. That's the fourth filter. When the story is inconvenient for the powers that be, you'll see the flak machine in action, discrediting sources, trashing stories, and diverting the conversation. To manufacture consent, you need an enemy, a target. That common enemy is the fifth filter. Communism, terrorists, immigrants, a common enemy. A boogeyman to fear helps corral public opinion. 5 filters, one big media theory. Consent is being manufactured all around you, all the time.
Biddy boo, biddy boo, biddy boo.